So last night, before the sun even had a chance to rise, Minneapolis woke up to a nightmare that modern America has never seen before: long lines of deportation buses quietly rolling into the city, their headlights sweeping across row after row of houses as if searching for someone in the darkness. I know this sounds hard to believe. I thought so too, but according to what was shared with me by a source inside DHS, roughly 90,000 Somalis were told they had to be out by dawn. Those 3 words alone were enough to paralyze the largest Somali community in Minneapolis with fear. And then, as you can imagine, everything descended into chaos. From Cedar, Riverside to Phillips and Elliot Avenue, people were jolted awake by pounding on doors at 3 a.m. Children screaming, the harsh white glare of federal vehicles shining straight into bedroom windows. The press is calling the forces that showed up last night deportation troops, a phrase that already feels heavy. But when you watch the videos shot by neighbors, shadowy figures being hurried away, black buses with tinted windows, it's far more terrifying than that. And this wasn't just an immigration enforcement operation. We're talking about a political shock, a decision issued in secret under cover of darkness by a president who once vowed he would clean out Minneapolis. The question everyone is whispering this morning, and I'm sure you're thinking the same, is why Minneapolis? Why right now, and why on a scale so massive, no one could have imagined it? Because if a president can deploy hundreds of federal agents into a city in total silence, only to have tens of thousands of people taken away before sunrise, what does that say about the power he wields, and where the real limits of that power actually lie? Let me tell you what happened in that darkness. Barely had Minneapolis begun to recover from the night it was swept clean, when the first name thrust in front of the cameras was Governor Tim Walz. He repeated one sentence over and over at every press conference this morning: the state was completely blindsided. He wanted to drive home the point that Minnesota was given no notice, no consultation, not even a minute's warning before federal convoys descended on the city in the middle of the night. But within just a few hours, conservative media unanimously erased that message and replaced it with a different accusation: that all of this happened on his watch, that if he truly had control of his own state, Minneapolis wouldn't have fallen into such chaos. Sound familiar? Of course, because this is the same tired political playbook we saw dozens of times under Trump. Anything bad that happens, no matter the reason, is his fault. And then, as if on cue, the second name stepped into the storm: Ilhan Omar. If Walz was portrayed as the guy who let this happen under his watch, Omar was instantly cast as the one who knew but stayed silent. Trump, in his midday speech with that familiar triumphant tone, said Omar had protected the Somali community too much, that she put them above America, and that she herself created the conditions that made the city a target. And Fox News, well, you can guess, ran hours of montages showing Omar standing next to Somali families at community events, then slapped blazing red text across the screen: she knew. No, they had no evidence. No, they didn't even ask her. But they know exactly what kind of imagery will make the public think Omar somehow foresaw an entire federal deportation operation that not even the state government was told about. Trump doesn't attack Ilhan Omar because she's wrong. He attacks her because she's the perfect target in the way he wields power. A woman, a person of color, Muslim, an immigrant, representing a community he has repeatedly described with slurs. This is the familiar and dangerous formula Trump has repeated for years. When he needs a scapegoat, he doesn't look for facts, he looks for an image. And to his political base, Omar is that image. But Minneapolis isn't just these two political figures. The entire city is torn apart, visibly and painfully. On the city council, some members immediately stood up to condemn the deportations, calling them a blatant human rights violation. Others stayed silent, not because they agreed, but because they're terrified of the political blowback if they speak out. Because they've seen this movie before: anyone who opposes Trump gets crushed within 24 hours, smeared by Fox News, dragged across MAGA social media by thousands of comments. All of this, what you're seeing right now, isn't new. It matches, line for line, the script we saw in the earlier welfare fraud scandal: a complicated event reduced to Democrats' fault, a detailed story turned into a 10-word slogan, and a community, Somalis then, Somalis now, turned into a convenient target. If that fraud case was a political firestorm, what happened last night was a Category 5 hurricane ripping through the political heart of Minnesota. And as the accusations started flying, they weren't aimed only at whoever was actually responsible. They were aimed at the people Trump wanted to turn into symbols, in this case, Walz and Omar. And once a story becomes a symbol, it stops being about the truth. It becomes a weapon. And Minneapolis this morning is the battlefield. When you look at what actually happened on the ground last night, in Cedar, Riverside, home to the largest Somali community in America, you understand why the whole city is still shaking this morning. The first videos that surfaced online came from that neighborhood, shaky, pitch-black footage lit only by the harsh white headlights of federal vehicles. You see shadowy figures being dragged out of their apartments while the sky still hadn't turned that pre-dawn gray-blue. You hear children crying, mothers screaming their kids' names in panic, doors slamming as ICE officers burst in like they were raiding dangerous criminals. The people loaded onto the buses weren't just undocumented. In the hundreds of clips sent to our newsroom, you see people whose green cards expired a few months ago, people in the middle of asylum applications still waiting for interviews, people waiting for immigration court hearings, yes, people following the legal process. There were people with valid TPS filings and re-examination appointments. There were even legal U.S. citizens taken away just because their last name matched someone on the list. When you watch a 68-year-old grandmother handcuffed on her own doorstep simply because her name resembled someone a federal agent mistakenly flagged on a hundreds-page list, that's not law and order. That's chaos. Organized chaos. Chaos carried out with federal funding. Chaos with intent. And you know what makes it even scarier? Watching Minneapolis police, the city's own police, standing on the sidewalk looking on and telling residents they had no idea what was happening. One officer told people, "We don't know what they're doing either. We weren't briefed." That's something you never want to hear from your own city's police. In live streams from white American residents, yes, people not part of the targeted community, you hear them sobbing, you see the panic in their eyes as they film the scene in front of them. Buses rolling down the streets, groups of people silently pushed aboard. One woman, crying, said this is the darkest night Minneapolis has seen since the 2020 riots. She wasn't exaggerating. Not at all. Because just like the original script's rap sheet section, where every individual was described through thick criminal records, this time the list of people taken was presented in a completely different way, itemized by immigration case numbers, green card expiration dates, TPS receipt numbers, asylum case codes. It was a legal list, not a racial one. But the way it was used, the way it was abused, was exactly like a sweep targeting one specific community. When that list was activated at 3 a.m., when hundreds of federal agents flooded the walkways between apartment buildings, when an entire neighborhood heard the clank of metal handcuffs in the dark, no matter what legal language it was wrapped in, the real-life experience of the people being taken away can only be described with one word: terror. And Minneapolis, once again, became the epicenter of that terror. While everyone was still trying to process what had just happened in Minneapolis's darkness, we started receiving the first internal documents, memos, operational guidelines, hastily signed deployment orders that, when you piece them together into a full picture, leave you asking only one thing. How was this ever approved? According to a DHS employee, Operation Nightfall, that's the official name of the campaign the press is still guessing at, was greenlit at a speed so fast, no one had time to finish reading the briefing packets. No briefing for Congress, no hearings, no public announcement. The entire operation rested on a vague, almost forgotten clause in the Immigration and Nationality Act that allows the president to take extraordinary measures in emergency situations affecting national security. But what counts as an emergency? Who defines it? When does that definition get triggered? The answer, according to the people who designed Operation Nightfall, was simple. When the president says so. And if you think this only came to light after the buses rolled into Minneapolis, think again. At a rally in Pennsylvania 2 days ago, Trump stood in front of a roaring MAGA crowd and said, brimming with smug satisfaction, "We're clearing out Minneapolis in one night." The audience cheered, screamed, chanted his name. But to television viewers, to Minneapolis residents sitting down to dinner, that statement sounded less like a policy promise and more like a threat. I said it live on MSNBC that very night. This is not an immigration operation. This is a political message. If you look back at similar campaigns in American history, you'll see a familiar and honestly terrifying pattern. Operation Wetback in 1954 wasn't just used to manage immigration, it was used to send a political message to conservative voters of that era. Then came the Muslim ban, rolled out early in Trump's first term, a policy that, according to his own advisors at the time, was designed to resonate with the base more than to address any actual threat. And no one in Minneapolis has forgotten 2016, when tensions flared between MPD and the Somali community and were inflated into a campaign slogan. Every time, every era, the goal never changed: create an us versus them narrative that makes supporters feel they're part of a battle bigger than the facts. And Operation Nightfall, with its 90,000 out by dawn notices, is the upgraded version of everything that came before. Whistleblowers inside DHS told us they were ordered to stay completely silent, not even allowed to talk to colleagues in other divisions. One said she was threatened with losing her job just for asking how the arrest list was compiled. Another said the warrants, thousands of them, were signed like grocery receipts. No independent identity checks, no file verification, no cross-referencing. Even a glance at the list showed duplicate last names, first names, addresses, one whistleblower said, but they still signed. Just imagine what that means for a community that's already spent decades living under suspicion. And now, when people ask, is this legal? The terrifying truth is, it only has to be technically legal, not morally reasonable. That's how campaigns like Nightfall survive. And you, me, anyone who grew up in a democracy still trying to believe we have laws to restrain power, have to ask ourselves, so where exactly are those limits? Because if an unprecedented mass deportation can be approved in silence, activated in darkness, and carried out in a city that's nightly touted as safe and free, then we have to admit one thing to each other. This is not normal. This is not how America works. And you know that. And then, just hours after the last buses left Minneapolis in the pale first light of morning, we started seeing the cracks in the system that Operation Nightfall left behind. Cracks not just in law or politics, but in the everyday heartbeat of the city. In Cedar, Riverside, schools reported this morning that a third of Somali students were absent. Not sick, not bad weather. They were gone because their families were no longer in Minneapolis. Many kids who did show up came to school with terrified eyes, not knowing if their parents would still be waiting at the gate when the final bell rang. Local hospitals reported something unprecedented: children admitted with no guardian to pick them up because parents or relatives had been swept up in the raid. A nurse at Hennepin Healthcare told us 3 kids, ages 2, 5, and 7, had to stay overnight because no one answered the phone. One of them kept asking over and over, "Where's my mom?" and no one had an answer. On Franklin Avenue, a Somali store owner told our reporter, the whole neighborhood disappeared in one night. Grocery stores empty, cars abandoned in front of apartment buildings, apartments that used to be lit all night now pitch black, as if someone had sucked every bit of warmth out of the block. But the humanitarian fallout is what has truly plunged Minneapolis into crisis. We've received hundreds of reports of children separated from mothers on the spot, people loaded onto buses without time to grab blood pressure meds or insulin, people with legal jobs, morning shifts, stable lives, gone from payrolls within 12 hours, no one knowing where they were taken. Immigration attorneys in the city are completely overwhelmed. Hotlines jammed 24/7, offices packed with relatives trying to find information, while the lawyers themselves can't reach ICE or DHS for even the most basic details. One attorney said, "I've never seen the system collapse like this. This isn't law enforcement, this is mass abduction." And as in every Minneapolis crisis, religious groups, especially Lutheran and Catholic churches, immediately stepped up. They set up shelters, opened fellowship halls for the families left behind, prepared food, made lists of the missing. One pastor told us, voice heavy, "We've helped people flee war, flee violence, but we've never had to help them flee their own government. When the licensing system is misused, we get a scandal. When the immigration system is misused, we get a humanitarian disaster. Not a scandal, not a policy debate, a disaster." That happened this morning, right in the heart of an American city. The Minneapolis City Council held an emergency session this afternoon. Not an empty seat in the room, just exhausted, terrified, furious faces. One council member stood up and said, "This is the largest single-city mass deportation in modern U.S. history." Another waved a shaking sheet of paper and said the list of children needing emergency shelter was already 3 pages long. If you live in Minneapolis, tonight you will never forget the sound of those white vehicles, the sound of engines rumbling in the dark, the sound of hurried footsteps in apartment hallways, the sound of metal doors slamming shut. That is the sound of a system no longer serving its people. That is the sound of power used without restraint. And sadly, that is the sound of what happens when a community is turned into a target, not because they did anything wrong, but because they were convenient. To understand why Minneapolis descended into such chaos, you have to look inside the new machinery of power the White House has been running, what DHS insiders unofficially but chillingly call the deportation troops. This is not traditional ICE, not the usual Border Patrol teams, and not standard U.S. Marshals on federal assignments. According to the leaked documents we obtained, this force is a special hybrid, ICE agents pulled from across the country, CBP personnel from the borders, and a small contingent of U.S. Marshals temporarily detailed to domestic security duties. 3 different agencies, 3 different rulebooks combined into one unit with a name that sounds like a wartime program. And more importantly, the documents show the deportation troops are authorized to bypass local jurisdictions, meaning they can operate inside Minneapolis city limits without permission from local police, the state attorney general, or any elected body. They are also granted nighttime enforcement authority, an administrative term that sounds mild but in practice means they can conduct arrests in the dark, any hour, any residential area. No advance notice, no coordination, no need for a local judge's warrant if a federal one was pre-signed. And as we went page by page through the leaked files, the scale became even more shocking. The ultimate goal is to deport 300,000 people within 6 months. Minneapolis was only the test city, the first proving ground, because quoting the document directly, the city has the largest Somali community in the United States and a traceable residential structure. Did you catch that phrase? Traceable residential structure. It makes your skin go cold in a way ordinary bureaucratic language never does. And then when you watch the videos from last night, you instantly understand their method. Groups of 12 to 15 people taken out of homes like an assembly line. Each group checked off the list, marked, loaded onto buses, moved to holding centers on the outskirts. No breaks, no delays. It ran like industrial logistics, only the product was human beings. Another video, the one that sent the internet into meltdown, shows a family being split right on their doorstep. Father pushed onto a bus, mother held back, child clinging to dad's hand and screaming. The person filming, voice shaking, said, "We thought this only happened at the border, not in front of our own houses." And while Minneapolis was still reeling, other states started feeling the chill down their spines. Michigan, Ohio, Maine, all home to concentrated immigrant communities, simultaneously demanded the White House confirm whether they were next. No answer, not one email reply, not one press conference. That silence to the governors was scarier than bad news. When the president can send federal troops into an American city in the middle of the night without telling the governor, it tells us something very uncomfortable about power. And that's exactly what's happening. On the national stage, this mass deportation has quickly become a political weapon. At rallies, Trump describes nightfall as a triumph, proof of the strength of the federal government and a promise to his loyal supporters that he'll go even harder. MAGA influencers turned it into a trend, live streams, commentary, cheering, memes. You see them saying, "Minneapolis is just the beginning." Meanwhile, the National Republican Party is fracturing. Some cheer the move, calling it restoring order. Others stay silent, unwilling to endorse but too afraid to oppose, because they know what happened to anyone who ever crossed Trump, from Jeff Sessions to Bill Barr, from Mike Pence to anyone deemed not loyal enough. This is the repeating motif. You saw it in the fraud case, in the government shutdowns, in every political crisis of the last several years, where Trump uses power as a form of punishment to prove he can act before anyone can react. Operation Nightfall is simply the bigger, bolder, riskier version of the same pattern. And when you put all these pieces together, the new task force, the local jurisdiction bypass, the mass arrest lists, Congress's silence, Trump's pride, the state's confusion, the community's terror, you see one clear picture. This isn't just a Minneapolis story anymore. This is the story of a president testing exactly how far his power can go. And last night, that limit was pushed farther than ever before. As we come to the end of this story, at least the part that has seen daylight, what I hope you'll remember for a very long time is this. Last night wasn't just about Minneapolis. It was about America and the limits of power. Because last night, in the darkness, a president tested how far he could go without being stopped. And everything that happened, from the 90,000 out by dawn notices, to children crying in apartment hallways, to white vehicles racing away as if trying to outrun the sunrise, poses three big questions every American, no matter their politics, has to ask themselves. First question, can a president deport 90,000 people in a single night, and is that consistent with the Constitution? The Constitution isn't just a document, it's the map of where power is supposed to stop. And if an action on the scale of nightfall can happen without Congress, without notice to the states, without public accounting, then the question stops being, is it legal, and becomes, if it's wrong, who is going to stop it? Second question, who will be the next target? Because American history shows us that when one community is singled out, others can follow, not because they did anything wrong, but because they fit a political narrative. Today it's Minneapolis, but tomorrow, Michigan, Maine, Ohio, or the city you're living in right now. And the third question, maybe the most important, if the American people look away, what gets normalized next? Because every abuse of power in history started with a moment when people thought, it'll probably just be this one. But when the state starts using nighttime power against a community, any community, that's not just news, that's a test of democracy. And the question isn't which party you belong to. The question is, do you believe power should have limits? Do you believe the government should never show up at someone's door at 3 a.m. with no warning, no transparent process, no public oversight? Do you believe an American city should never wake up to discover thousands of its neighbors vanished overnight? If we stay silent, it will only get worse. I want you to do three things. Watch. Because information is the one thing power can't take from you. Don't stay silent. Because silence is what lets these things keep happening and defend legitimacy. Not because you like or hate someone, but because the rule of law is the only thing standing between a democracy and the darkness waiting to swallow it. We don't know everything yet, but what we do know is already enough to sound the alarm that this is a turning point moment. And what we do or don't do from this moment forward will decide what kind of country we are. This isn't just Minneapolis's story, this is all of ours. And it's not over. If you want to keep following analyses like this every night, please subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Thank you for being with us, and see you in the next broadcast.